Well, I want to thank everyone for joining the second edition of our Developing Meaningful Online Learning Experiences series. Just wanted to say I'm very thankful for Netta and Genya for joining us. And obviously, if you're not familiar with Netta and Genya, both of them, and Genya lives in Lebanon, Netta is from Lebanon, and obviously there have been some tragedies there. Was it yesterday, day before, with the massive explosion down by the pier? I know for me, we were talking about it before we got online, I have family, friends who are from there, obviously the devastation, looking at the videos, our hearts break, and go out to the city of Beirut that's going through that and dealing with COVID and dealing with, so many other issues in the world right now. And so just need to say thank you to Genya and Netta, who's, I'm sure, they're going through a lot and, have had other things on their minds as well, but to continue to do this series. So just want to say thank you to both of you for doing with this. And, our hearts are with you right now as we see that. Once again, this series is designed to provide an overview and a context of how you can move from emergency remote teaching. And I love that perspective, Netta, that we've talked about, that's what we had to get through from COVID, and transition that to meaningful online learning experiences. And I'm a firm believer there is a difference. There's a better way to do this than just going up on Zoom and doing an emergency live session. That there's a way to build this. And in the first part, they did a wonderful overview of how to strategize in creating these online meaningful experiences. And today we're going to move that conversation into the technology that you can leverage to really engage the learner. And so with that, I want to turn over to Netta to go through the series and to begin our topic today.
Great. Thank you so much, Brett. Thank you for hosting us for the second series. I also would like to say that my colleague and friend, Genya, who's a presenter on these webinars, just lost her dad last week. So unexpectedly, she lost her dad in Lebanon. And then there was the explosion yesterday. So she's dealing with a lot, and our sympathy goes to Ganya. I'm very grateful that she agreed to make herself available today to share this webinar with me. I couldn't have done it without her, because Ganya is an expert on learning technologies, and she really has practical knowledge of the concepts that we are going to present today, and the concepts that we have been presenting in this webinar. And she's been actually implementing all of the examples that we're going to show you in her classroom virtually. So thank you, Ganya, for joining us, and thank you, everyone. As Brett said, there's a lot going on in the world. It's just been a little bit difficult to just stay abreast, but we're very happy to continue with our series. And this is the second webinar, and it's called Using Technology to Support Meaningful Online Learning Strategies. So I want to make sure you have the acronym MOL. So just remember, please, the acronym. This is from the first webinar, and you should have received the recording of the first webinar if you registered. So the acronym MOL stands for Meaningful Online Learning. And I just want to emphasize that this series, as Brett mentioned, is aimed at providing you with both theoretical and pedagogical foundations to online teaching and learning. And so in the first webinar, we talked about the 5 principles for meaningful online learning, which I'm going to recap in a moment. And then we're going to delve into how to use technology to support meaningful online instructional strategies. Today, we're going to unpack the affordances of learning technologies, and we're going to demonstrate how to leverage these affordances for online teaching and learning. And then the third webinar in a week from today is going to focus on developing online assessments, which, as you know, is a critical topic that completes this the series of the webinars. It completes the online learning experience And as always, these webinars will be recorded, and our hope is that at the end of every webinar, you will come up with practical strategies and specific learning activities that helps you to become a successful online teacher and or online learning designer. So let me just briefly recap what we did last time. Again, think about this as sort of a framework, as an organizer, if you will, as an advanced organizer about meaningful online learning. As Brett mentioned, you know, instead of looking at remote teaching, emergency remote teaching, we want you to have a framework. We want you to have those 5 principles, always thinking about them as a framework. We explained them in the first webinar, but just very briefly, you know, the 5 principles for meaningful online learning are you want to engage the learners in, you know, active learning, constructive learning, cooperative learning, authentic learning, and intentional learning. So another thing that I just want to recap quickly is that don't think of these principles as isolated principles. So if you're designing for a learning activity for active learning, it could pretty much well be also supporting the constructive principle, as we demonstrated in the examples we showed last time. And if you're designing for a learning activity that supports the constructive principle, the articulative, reflective components or adjectives of this principle, you might as well also be designing for the cooperative principle. So keep in mind that those principles are interdependent, and if you can just think about the 5 principles as you design your online learning activities or facilitate your online learning course. So the 5 takeaways again would be: you want to engage learners in intentional learning, you want to engage learners in active learning, you want to engage learners in constructive learning, in cooperative learning, and in authentic learning. So even if you just design one learning activity for each of those principles, we think that you're going to be very successful in making your online course or making the online learning experience very effective for your students and very engaging for your students. So the objectives for today's webinar, we're going to go over 3 things. We're going to go over the affordances of technologies and why those matter. We're going to go over what do we mean by instructional strategies for meaningful online learning. And of course, we're going to show you examples of use or learning activities that you can take away and actually implement in your own context. So let me start with the affordances of technology. What does the word affordance mean, and why is it important to be thinking about the affordances of learning technologies? So I don't know if I've said this during the first webinar, but I have a lot of colleagues and researchers and, you know, in academia and other contexts that really think that technology is just a tool. So technology is just a delivery medium. Well, I'm totally not in concert with that. I'm not in agreement with that. In fact, technology is not just a tool. Different technologies have different affordances, possibilities for action, that is, and they really shape our sociocultural practices. If you just think back to the birth of the internet in the early 90s and the web later, you will see that these types of technologies have definitely shaped our sociocultural practices politically, socially, even our learning experience. So no, technology is not just a tool. Technology shapes our learning. Technology is itself the message. And as the scholar, communications media scholar, Marshall McLuhan, I don't know if you've heard of him, but he's the one who came up with the statement, the medium is the message. So for example, if you hear something on the radio, then it's going to have a different impact on you versus seeing something on a video or seeing it on the news or in a different medium, you know, versus somebody in person telling you something. So this is what Marshall McLuhan meant by the medium is the message, meaning that technology matters and the type of technology matters. It shapes the learning experience. It shapes the way you look at things. It impacts your experience. So we need to keep this in mind as we are designing online learning experiences. So that, let's just take it a little bit further. And so as you could see here, I'm talking about a pencil. So let's look at this very simple but very powerful technology. A pencil, in fact, is a type of technology. So what are the affordances of a pencil? What can you do with a pencil? So please tell us in the chat. Let's take a minute. Tell us in the chat, what can you do with a pencil? Not only the primary affordance of a pencil, but everything you can think of. So I'll give you a minute here to tell us in the chat, what can you do with a pencil? Okay, bright, sharpen.
Communicate, draw a picture.
Weapon. You can use it to punch someone. Not that we need to do that. You can use it to comb your hair. You can see these are all affordances. Hold up your hair if needed. Absolutely. Scratch down your absolutely. Erase, that's a primary function.
Mm.
Measure, that's a good one, right, Kenya?
Yeah.
Chew
Hold
on.
up your hair, Nada. Hold up your hair.
Hold up, yep, I saw that. Drum, you could use it to play. So you could see these are all affordances of this technology. Thank you. So the primary affordances, though, of a pencil, the primary functionality is to write, to erase, to draw. I mean, these are primary functionalities, but all of the other affordances that you mentioned are also functionalities. Some of them may be negative affordances, some of them may be positive, but they're not primary. So that's what we mean by affordances, meaning, you know, you look at a tool, you look at a technology, and you need to examine its affordances. So let's look at this concept of affordances in light of technologies. So I'm presenting this framework here. I hope I'm on the right screen. I don't know if you can see this slide. This is a very useful classification, if you will, of learning technologies that we use for designing online learning experiences and technology-supported learning environments. So if you can see on this slide, there are 6 categories of learning technologies, and we group them like this because of the theory of affordances, meaning that we try to classify them in with their kind of primary functionalities in mind. So you've got content creation and delivery tools on the left-hand side, upper left-hand side here. We have a category called collaboration and communication tools. We have a category called assessment and analytics tools. We have a category called immersive tools. So I'm sure you would guess what are some of the examples of technologies in the immersive category. So if you want to share that, these would be things like 3D immersive virtual worlds, avatar-based, virtual worlds, simulations, games. All of these types of technologies, their primary affordance is they immerse the learner in the experience. We also have a category called knowledge representation tools. We also refer to it as mind tools because this category is primarily used by the learner to articulate their knowledge and understanding. So if you remember last time, we talked about mind mapping tools and concept mapping tools. These are the types of technologies that fall into this category. We also have a category called information search and resource management. So this is really a cool framework that you could also keep in mind when you're looking at technologies in order to become aware of their primary affordances for online learning, and how can you use them effectively based on their primary affordances. Now, I want to mention that you will also find out that, for example, content creation tools would primarily be used by instructional designers and teachers, whereas knowledge representation tools would primarily be used by learners. But all of these technologies can be used by either of your audiences, either yourself as a teacher, as an instructional designer or also by your audience and your learners. So let's now dig deep into this framework of learning technologies, and let's go to the first category, which is the content creation tools. So as you could see, the purple bubble up here, one of the first examples of content creation tools would be learning management systems, such as Blackboard is the one we use at George Mason University, but I'm sure many of you are using other types of learning management systems, such as Moodle and Desire to Learn, and there's many other learning management systems, but not only the entire learning management system, but within the learning management system, you have content creation tools like module creations and those types of features that can be classified as content creation tools. So you also have Google Classroom that could be considered a content creation tool. And you also have a lot of web publishing tools such as Weebly and Wix and other HTML editors that you can use to create content, or you can ask your learners to use to create content. This could also apply to presentation tools such as PowerPoint or Google Slides. All of these types of technologies fall under content creation. And so you want to keep that, be aware of this category of learning technologies. And the primary function again, or the primary affordance, is to create and present and display content. So this particular category, if you will, of technology really supports the active, constructive, and authentic principles of meaningful online learning. So this is how I'm tying the affordance of the technology back to the principles of meaningful online learning. So, and we will show you examples of how this works in action. But tell us over the chat, what content creation tools have you been using, if any, and for what purpose have you been using them to provide presentations? I forgot to mention that YouTube is also an example of a content creation tool. So share with us, please, Camtasia or Canvas. Absolutely, that is Adobe Connect. Thanks, Sarah. Yep, Adobe Connect definitely. I think Adobe Connect, though, is not more of a communication tool. I believe it's more of a synchronous communication tool. Articulate Storyline, absolutely. Kaltura, if I'm not mistaken, right.
Yeah,
yeah.
that's like Camtasia.
Thanks, Ganya. It's a creation tool. It's a video creation tool. WordPress, absolutely. WordPress, you can create content, but I want to say WordPress can also be a communication tool in terms of the blogging affordances. Let's see. Screencastly, PDF files, absolutely. They're content creation. Word.
Google Classroom, yes, of course.
And Kaltura, narrated PowerPoints, absolutely. Kaltura with embedded quizzes. Teams, Microsoft Teams, that's, I think, more of a collaboration and communication tool. So, it can also project content. So this is really important, your examples, because as you could see from the figure, the classifications are overlapping. So they're not discrete. So maybe you've got, one type of tool that clearly is a content creation tool, but it can also have communication and collaboration affordances. So again, this is not, neat and clean and, the technology only fits there. But when you think about its primary affordance, then you can pretty much classify it in one of these 6 classifications. And as you know, our software designers have really been coming up with a lot of platform-based technologies that integrate everything. So LMS is sort of an integrative technology. So within an LMS, you can have communication tools, you can have content creation tools, you can also have analytics within the LMS, you can also have information search and resource management. So yes, pretty much when you think about technology as an integrated platform, then it gets a little bit difficult to sort of delineate across these categories. But it's really important to classify the learning technologies based on their affordances. So thank you for sharing that. I'm going to move to the second category up here, the collaboration and communication tools category. This is my favorite category. So I really integrate a lot of communication and collaboration in my online classes. And in the last webinar, if you remember, we talked about how collaboration and communication tools in online settings can facilitate synchronous and asynchronous interactions, remember? And so this helps reduce the isolation and the attrition that can go along with learning online, being an online student. We talked about that last time. And these collaboration communication tools can really help personalize the learning experience for the student. And it can establish social presence and help establish cognitive presence and teacher presence. So this is a really important category of learning technologies. And which meaningful online learning principle do you think this category of technologies best exemplifies out of the 5? Remember, the 5 are active, constructive, cooperative, intentional, and authentic. So if I were to ask you which of those 5 would the cooperative principle? Thank you, Michelle. Absolutely. So these types of affordances will certainly support the cooperative principle, or you want to call it the collaborative principle, the conversational, the dialogical, affordances of that principle. So also, if you don't mind sharing with us, what types of collaboration and communication tools have you been using in your online teaching or online learning design? OneDrive, absolutely, for sharing documents, absolutely. Microsoft Teams and Zoom. Google Meet, Collaborate Ultra, OneDrive. Slack, absolutely. A lot of corporations use Slack. SharePoint, Microsoft Teams, WebEx. Trello, great. Yep. It does support all of that too. Wikis, yes, see that. Dropbox, SharePoint, absolutely, great guys. Yeah, these are all examples of communication and collaboration tools. So on the slide, obviously we have Skype. Skype hasn't been, I'm actually surprised that Skype, didn't really do a good foray into the remote teaching last couple of months. It's Zoom, obviously, and WebEx, and some of the other examples that you guys mentioned have actually sort of, taken over. Google Drive, WhatsApp also has been used. We talked about chat and texting, chat tools last time in the first webinar, video conferencing tools, and file sharing tools. So again, a lot of the examples that you provided, like Google Drive and Dropbox, would really be under the file sharing tools category. And then you've got the video conferencing tools and the chat tools. So this is great. So I am going to now turn it over to Gania so she can talk about the assessment and analytics category of learning technologies.
Thank you, Nada. This is really a great framework. I use Nada's book to teach my graduate students, and this classification has been missing in the literature, so this is really great. I want to mention that online assessments, people that I've been working with here in Lebanon have expressed their concerns about online assessment. It's one major issue. Although the third webinar is dedicated to assessment here, we will briefly provide some examples. And if you're really interested in the topic, you can attend the third webinar. It's specially created for this topic. But you might know, based on your experience online teaching, there are different forms of assessment, formative and summative. And accordingly, there are technologies for both purposes. Examples of these technologies are synchronous assessment tools such as student response systems like Poll Everywhere, like Easy Polls that you can use, or Zoom polls that you can use as are teaching synchronously through a video conference. You want to engage the learners and assess their learning. This is one example. Other examples of online assessment technologies that you can use asynchronously while your students are doing their work at their own pace, are Google Forms, Quizlet, digital portfolios, which we will elaborate on more later in the next webinar. On this slide, I'm sharing a word cloud from Poll Everywhere. What you see here, the words, you see like the largest word is the word that was mostly repetitively written by the respondents in the poll. Poll Everywhere is really a great tool. It's a free tool, an online tool that you can use for student response in synchronous and live online sessions. Please share with us any of the technologies that you have been using to assess your learners online in the chat box. We'd like to hear from you. Any technologies that you've been using for assessment? Yes,
yeah, Wendy's using Poll Everywhere. There's something called Mentimeter, right?
Mentimeter, it's similar to Poll Everywhere. Zoom polls, it's practical if you're using Zoom for teaching. Moodle quizzes, excellent. It's an asynchronous online assessment technology. Zoom polls, Collaborate Ultra polls. I've never used this before. Interesting. Kahoot really is very interesting as well if you're using it for assessment. There's many, many more technologies that we will share with you later in the next webinar. Google, Moodle assessments and quizzes. Great.
Yeah, Google Forms, you can use Google Forms to elicit responses from your audience.
Yeah. Blackboard, I'm not sure Blackboard has a polling system. It has a survey checklist feature and a quiz feature.
Baseline analytics. It also has analytics.
Right.
You can serve up analytics to tell you how many of your students have actually visited websites or, you know, interacted. So it does serve up analytics.
Yeah, and analytics, as Nada knows, is a big thing now in online learning to track your students' progress, your students' access to the material, their engagement. It's a growing field, and we'll talk more about it in the next webinar. The next category is immersive tools, which refers to tools used to create a digital environment that allows participants to be totally immersed in the context that the environment represents. Examples of these immersive tech environments are simulations, educational games, and virtual reality experiences that require wearable technologies. For instance, here, it's something that we mentioned in the previous webinar. Virtual labs are being used a lot in online learning. Now that students cannot access the actual labs, the physical labs on campuses or schools, virtual labs are being used. I added there, Nada, it's the, yeah, I added a QR code for an open source material that you can use for virtual labs. These are all for free that you can find on this link. There's many of them if you want, if you're teaching sciences or history, that you can use and take advantage of.
That's great. So if you have your phone, you can, I think, just point your camera
on the QR code.
On the QR code.
Yeah, it's the box, it's the black box there. Another example of immersive tools are games, which put the player in a digitally created world to interact with the elements of the world. For instance, SimCity, which is a game that people play for fun, gives players the opportunity to practice city and environment planning. Similarly, the popular game Minecraft has an education version, for example, that supports different subjects and skills. There's many games out there, many websites for educational games and simulations that can be used in teaching some subjects or in training, in corporate training as well. Are there any simulations or games that you have used for online teaching that you can share with us, please, in the chat? We would like to hear more from you.
And also, if you could tell us, what are your thoughts about which meaningful online learning principles out of the 5, again, active, constructive, authentic, intentional, and cooperative, which ones of these principles do you think immersive technologies exemplify or support?
Yeah, great. So So Mihaela said, FAT simulations. Yes, they're very common in science. Excellent. Adobe Connect has a few that you can use and you can create. Monty Hall. Okay, excellent. Edheads.org.
Yeah,
Okay, great. Yeah, and which of the principles are addressed in simulations and games? So is it the active, the authentic, intentional, constructive, cooperative? Which one do you think best represents these types of technologies? Of course, active. All of them anyway, but mainly authentic, yeah. I think authentic more, because you're creating a copy, a simulation of the real world for students who cannot go to the actual field to try something. Can be cooperative, of course, as well.
Yep. Can be, right. Yeah, I agree with you, Gania. I think, I mean, authentic probably is the primary, because in a simulation or a game-based learning environment, we try to, again, the designers, you know, try to mimic the real world as much as possible. But I think, as Jen mentioned, you know, if you're immersing students into this world, it's definitely authentic, but it also supports, I think, active and constructive. And as others said, intentional also, because it's goal directed, especially games. Games are very intentional. They have a goal. You know, players in a game have to achieve a specific goal. So it's very goal directed. Yeah, that's great.
Right. Okay. So now we will move on to the next technology category, which is knowledge representation tools, or mind tools, which we also refer to as mind tools. Why do we refer to them as mind tools? It's because they represent how the learner's mental structures. When we say mind tools, it means they show how ideas are hyperlinked and interconnected in our brain when we read something and try to understand it, or when we brainstorm some ideas. We talked last time about Kaggle, which what you see in this image on the top right as a tool. There's many other tools out there that you can use, simple tools. If you want to use tools that do not require internet connectivity, you can use, for example, Smart Art in Word or Excel sheets or other tools. They're really helpful in helping learners to synthesize information and draw linkage between the content. They also represent information visually, which supports comprehension and remembering information. So for instance, when I have something complex that I want my students to understand, I always ask them to create mind tools. I will share an example later with you. Can you please share with us in the chat some examples of technologies that you have used with your students or audience for knowledge representation? And which of the 5 principles do you think this technology category represents?
Has anyone used mind mapping tools, you know, concept mapping tools? As Gania mentioned, you know, spreadsheets, but if you engage your students in developing spreadsheets and classifying. Okay.
No, he shared Padlet. Yeah, I wanted to mention Padlet. Padlet is really a very interesting tool for knowledge representation, which you can use as a digital board, or you can use it also for linking ideas to each other, like a mind map. MindMeister. There's Bubbles too. I don't know if you know it, Bubbles. My favorite is Kaggle, because with a free account, you can create a collaborative activity where learners can collaborate to create a mind map.
So then it becomes both, you know, supporting the primary function of collaboration communication tools as well as knowledge tools.
Exactly. Yeah, whiteboards on WebEx could count, of course, because especially when you're drawing concept maps and linking ideas to each other. So any tools that you can create information in a visual way that shows interconnection between ideas is an example of knowledge representation tools. Active and cooperative. Yes, exactly, Sarah.
I would argue though, if I would argue that the constructive principle is probably the most aligned with this category of technologies, only because it's articulative, as Genya mentioned, you know, it's exposing the mental models of what the student is experiencing, the knowledge representation. So I would say constructive would be the number one principle for meaningful online learning. And then of course, from the examples that you guys provided, definitely the active and the cooperative sort of ensue after that.
Yeah. Storyboarding apps, yes, yes. I will share an example about this also today. Thank you. So for the next technology category, information search and resource management, you probably know that anytime you ask students for information about something, 92% of them turn to internet search engines like Google to find information about anything. This shows how important search engines such as Google are for today's students. However, searching the internet does not really have to be a learning experience unless it is intentional and targeted towards a goal. Noam Chomsky, he's an educational psychologist, has like a whole video about this, how searching the internet and reading on the internet does not mean that you are learning unless there's a goal, unless you know what you're learning about and it's intentional and targeted. So this is one of the principles that of the MOL framework. This technology category is not limited to search tools only. There's many other tools that fall under it, because finding information is one piece of information search. However, storing information, aggregating it, collecting it is another piece of it. Maybe some of you are familiar with Zotero, the search engine tool for research, where you can save articles on it and tag them and group them. Another example is Digo. It's a social bookmarking tool that allows you to save any search that you do on the internet, group it, tag it, categorize it, and even collaborate with other people that have the same interests. So it's not only limited to what you are interested in, but also it creates this kind of social interaction between other users on Digo. So these are some examples that we have. Even annotation, even with Digo, you can save a link, you can save a source and annotate it, write some notes about it for later use. So we need to teach our students not only to search the internet for information, but also how to store it, how to make meaning out of it, how to make it more intentional. Now we would like you to share with us any examples of technologies that you have used for information search and resource management. EndNote, yeah.
Yeah, EndNote.
Right. MS Teams channel posts. Pinterest, yeah, Pinterest. Degreed, I'm not familiar, Brenda, with Degreed, no.
Degreed is an amazing platform. Degreed is, I'm very familiar with it and I love that platform. It's expensive though, but yes, it allows you to.
It's not free.
Goals and yeah.
Yeah, EndNote, of course.
All right, we need
Toby. Yeah, we need to move.
Thank you.
To keep moving. So now I'm going to turn it over to Nada to talk to us about the instructional strategies for meaningful online learning and examples of use.
So we presented the technology classification, and of course you could revisit that in the recording of this webinar. I hope you found it useful and the examples of the technologies useful and became familiar with the concept of affordances. So now we're going to link that to what do we mean by instructional strategies for meaningful online learning. So again, this is another framework, but this one is specifically about what we mean by instructional strategies. So if you've studied instructional design, basically instructional strategies are what you do as instructional designers or as teachers or as faculty when you teach, when you facilitate a course, or when you design a course. So I really want to emphasize that instructional strategies is what we do as instructional designers, as teachers, when we implement our teaching and learning process. So again, we have classified these instructional strategies into 3 categories. So let me start with the supportive category on the bottom right, the yellow one. So for example, do you do modeling for your students? If you teach math or science, do you model how you solve equations? Do you model algorithms? Do you explain them? This is a very important instructional strategy called modeling and explaining. And many of us as teachers and faculty do that. We used to do it on the blackboard, you know, in the old days in the classrooms, but now we can do it via video. We could do it through presentations, through different technologies. Do you do coaching and mentoring? And how do you do scaffolding? How do you scaffold the learning process for your students? Do you give them resources to look at? Do you give them solved examples? Do you show them best practices? Do you bring in previous assignments from previous classes that you have deemed to be really good examples of what you want them to do? So scaffolding can be human scaffolding as well as non-human scaffolding in the form of resources. So this is the category of supportive instructional strategies. So let's move to the category of dialogic instructional strategies. And this is where you want to engage your students in articulation. We've talked about articulation last time, and this is a property, if you will, of the meaningful online learning principle of constructive learning. Also, dialogic strategies is when you engage your students in collaboration and social negotiation, and also reflection. Reflection is a huge instructional strategy that we should all be implementing in our online course designs and teaching, because we want our students to be able to reflect on their learning process. And there are many technologies that help with that. We want our students to be able to monitor their learning, to become metacognitive, to understand how they learn and what's working for them, to empower them to become self-directed learners. So reflection is another huge instructional strategy. And the third category in this model is exploratory, and, you know, engaging your students in problem-solving activities, in hypothesis generation, if you're teaching science, again, in exploration and creation, and also in role playing. And you could probably guess that immersive learning technologies would actually be very well suited for implementing exploratory instructional strategies, as well as information search category as well of technology. So again, this is sort of another organizer that you can think about when you're designing your online courses or facilitating your online course, and try to see how you can connect this back to the affordances of the technologies and also to the 5 principles of meaningful online learning. One final point I want to make about this advanced organizer, about this instructional strategies, is again, these instructional strategies are interrelated. So most likely, if you're engaging your students in problem solving as an instructional strategy, you're also supporting them with scaffolding. And you may also be doing modeling and explaining. And if you're engaging your students in collaboration and social negotiation, then you might also be doing role playing with them, or you might also be doing problem solving. So they are interrelated, but it's good to be able to think about them in these sort of 3 classifications. And also, as you guessed, probably the supportive strategies are things that the instructor does mostly, or the instructional designer, and the dialogic and exploratory strategies are more learner-centered versus teacher-centered. So I'm gonna start immediately into examples of use. So to get you guys to do the takeaway, so I'm gonna start with the first one. We've picked like one instructional strategy from each of the categories, and we've shown an example about that. So I've selected scaffolding. So scaffolding is a supportive instructional strategy, and it can best be supported by content creation tools. So what you're seeing in this example is an infographic. I'm sure you're familiar with infographics. So this is an infographic that was created by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration in the United States, NOAA. And it is an infographic that helps users, your learners, users, your audience. Actually, it teaches people what they need to know, about conserving their environment. So the infographic really allows them, if you can see here, you can see that the content is broken down by chunks into 10 manageable steps. You can only see 9 on this infographic on the slide, sorry about that, but into 10 manageable steps or actions or ways that a citizen can do at home, around town, or on the water to protect our oceans. So really, infographics are a content creation tool. You could see that it's, definitely helps you create content. It helps you chunk them into manageable chunks, and it really supports scaffolding because it supports students' understanding of the content. It reduces the complexity of the content, and it allows them to progress through their own zone of proximal development, if you will. So the instructional strategy of scaffolding really provides students with self-awareness, multiple perspectives, and sort of a self-management of their learning. And so it's a supportive learning culture. And I want to mention a quote by Seymour Papert, who was the kind of the father of constructionism. Unfortunately, he passed away a few years ago. And his famous saying is, you cannot teach people everything they need to know. The best you could do is position them where they can find what they need to know when they need to know it. So this is really kind of sums up the supportive strategies, and particularly scaffolding, is that you want to support your students so that they can then go on and explore and learn on their own. So let me move to the next slide. Oh, this is Gania. So I guess okay, go, sorry, I'll turn it to Gania.
So here's an example. Thanks, Nada. Here's an example. I'm trying to go fast because we don't have much time left. But I'll be providing 4 more examples of instructional strategies. Here's an example of an exploratory strategy that supports problem solving. This is an example of a learning activity that you can design to engage your students in problem solving. Exploratory strategies enable active and constructive learning and can be developed using collaboration and communication tools and knowledge representation tools. So this learning activity asks students to create a fishbone diagram to analyze the causes of missed basketball free throws. Fishbone technique is really interesting. Students love it. It's a simple method of mapping causes of a problem and showing factors that predict success in the problem space. If you want to add a collaborative and communication aspect to this assignment, learners can share their diagrams on VoiceThread, which is another technology for providing and sharing feedback among learners. It affords audio, video, and text feedback among students and instructors. The next example, briefly, I added, Nada, please, is an example of role-playing, which is an exploratory strategy as well. Somebody mentioned in the chat that they use storyboard. Storyboarding is a really powerful tool in role-playing. This tool, what you see in this image, is being developed through Storyboard, which is a free tool. Storyboarding and role-playing is important in content creation, creating information, collaborating, and communicating. The next example is an example of a dialogic strategy, collaboration, and social negotiation. As Nada has mentioned, and as you might have seen, the different strategies can overlap. So you might be doing dialogic, but at the same time exploratory, and at the same time other strategies that are interconnected. Here's a learning activity based on the dialogic instructional strategy of collaboration and social negotiation. It's an activity in my graduate course that I teach. The students were asked to complete some readings and watch videos related to elements of online courses. Then in pairs, they had to create a mind map that summarizes the elements of online courses. They were given the choice to use Bubbles or Kaggle, which I mentioned previously. to complete the task. I said I like Kaggle before, it's my favorite. So in this activity, the students engaged in several dialogic strategies at the same time, such as dialogic, collaboration and social negotiation, and reflection. After the students created the mind map, they had to reflect on a sample online course and analyze it using the mind map that they had created. In order to complete these tasks fully online, as is the case now with the COVID-19, students could use Skype or any other video conferencing tool to meet online. At the end of this activity, students were asked to read other groups' work and comment on each other in a discussion forum. So here's what a discussion forum looks like in a learning management system, in the next slide. And this dialogic strategy supports articulation and reflection. Most learning management systems such as Moodle, Google Classroom, Microsoft Teams, Blackboard, and Canvas have a discussion forum feature where the learners can post reflections about the content and discuss and communicate, which, as Nada has mentioned before, does create this form of social presence and teacher presence among the online learners so that they don't feel they are isolated in the online learning environment. So it's very important to create this kind of dialogic activities in online learning. And now I'm going to turn it over to Nada to synthesize the webinar.
Thank you, Genia. And I saw in the chat, one participant asked if we could send our slides ahead of time. We'll think about that. Maybe we could do it next time in a PDF format. I understand that you may not be able to see the slides very clearly, even though we tried really to design them in a way that is visible, but thank you for the suggestion. Now, of course, you're going to receive a recording of these webinars, and you can kind of go back through them, but I do understand why sending the slides in advance can help, you know, make it visually more appealing, and thank you for that suggestion. I will talk over this with Brett and Genia and see if we can send out our slides in advance in a PDF format. So I'm finalizing this now. This is the final kind of organizer that we want to share with you. So what we did today is we provided a classification of learning technologies for you. We talked about the concept of affordances, and we also showed you instructional strategies and examples of use. So if you look at the internal triangle here, it's really important to see that there are three sort of components of this triangle. There are the learning technologies at the top, which we've talked about, and their affordances. And then there are the instructional strategies on the bottom left. And we talked about three classifications of instructional strategies. And then there were the examples of use, the implementation of those instructional strategies into learning activities that your students would be engaged in. So as you could see, there's this alignment across these three components. Again, technology is not just a tool. The affordances of learning technologies precipitate the instructional strategies, and in turn, the instructional strategies lead to or precipitate the learning activities. And there's this sort of reciprocal interaction across these three components. And so what's really cool about this internal triangle is that you can start your design, or you can start thinking about your pedagogical approach for your online course in any of those components. For example, if your school says, okay, you have to use Google Classroom, that's it. So your school has decided that you have to use Google Classroom. Or if your university, like ours, has said you have to use the LMS Blackboard to facilitate your online teaching. So we have to start with the learning technologies. We don't have a choice. So we need to look at the affordances of the tools within the platform that we are supposed to use, and then look at those affordances and then see how can we align the affordances with the instructional technology strategies, which is sort of our teaching method, and then design appropriate learning activities. However, if you're a tried and true faculty member, you've been teaching a lot, and you have a pedagogical approach, say like experiential learning, or you do very active learning, then you might want to start with the instructional strategies. And you might want to say, based on the discipline that I'm teaching and the pedagogical approach that I have, I want to use these instructional strategies. I want to use role playing. I want to use modeling and explaining. I want to use, scaffolding in that way. And then you can look at the affordances of the learning technologies and align them or select the appropriate learning technologies that support your pedagogical strategy. And of course, then design learning activities. So as you could see, it's a very flexible framework, this inner triangle there, and you can start with any of those components to design effective and meaningful online learning. And of course, you want to keep the 5 principles of meaningful online learning always in the forefront. And we have tried to demonstrate how the learning activities that we showed you support these principles. So we hope that this has been meaningful. Again, if you want more information about this, there are lots of more examples in the Meaningful Online Learning book. And I also have a, I'm working on a mobile app. You can, if you have Google Play, unfortunately, it only works in on Androids, not on iPhones currently, but it's called the Tech Select Decision app. So it's a mobile app that actually helps you align your learning outcomes for the course, which we're going to talk about next time, with the instructional strategies and the types of technologies. So if you have Google Play and you can Google the app Tech Select, 2 words, Tech Select Decision Making app, that might be something you might want to look into. And of course, the book has a lot of examples of what we talked about today. So thank you for listening, and thank you for your contributions in the chat. Please let us know. We have about, I don't know how many minutes, not that many, right? So we have only a few minutes. If you have any questions or requests, please put them in the chat. Or you can turn on your video if you can. Was this helpful? Great webinar. Thank you. Thank you, Mihai.
Thank you for attending.
Thank you, Shreya. Thank you for attending. Thank you, guys. Can you let us know when we can receive the recording? I think Brett,
yeah,
as soon as it's in the cloud, they will send it to you. Maybe I should have put our email address. Brett, are you there? Can you tell the audience when they can expect to get the recording of this webinar? And we will send the slides too.
Right, yeah. Hopefully in the next couple of days, we'll be able to get both webinars up there. So we're a little backlogged with some content creation on our side, but they should be up soon.
Okay, okay, great. So they haven't received the first one yet, so.
Not yet.
Okay. So hopefully you'll get that soon. If you have any questions, you can email me or Genia. I don't know if we've provided our email addresses, but we can put they were on that first slide.
On the first slide, if you want to project it again, I don't know.
So hopefully you'll get those, and we will also send the slides in advance if we can. Okay, guys, thank you so much.
The
book is on Amazon. Yes, the book is on Amazon. You can get it as an ebook on Kindle, and it's very very reasonably priced. And you can also get it as a regular text. But yes, it is on Amazon.
I think there's a question.
You want to take
that?
Arlene?
Thank you, Arlene. There's a question. For teaching in general, do most professors allow students to download? I think this is the question that Jerry asked about the slides, Nada, and you answered about providing our slides. But I think Jerry is asking, do most professors allow students to download the slides in advance, and thus facilitating better note-taking and perhaps getting familiar with the lecture prior to the learning session? What is the best practice?
Yeah, I don't have an answer for this. Actually, that's a very, very good question. Typically, don't. I mean, as professors, like when you're teaching in the classroom in a face-to-face, if you're doing a presentation, which I try not to do a lot of, and right now we try to minimize them into 10 minutes max, but we usually don't share the slides in advance. I mean, we usually just project them. But then if it's a narrated presentation, we put it in Blackboard in the LMS and we put a link to it. Or But after the fact, what do you think, Gania? I don't know. I mean, I don't
Um,
usually.
I usually post them on Moodle right like 10 minutes before class.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, in case students want to open it and take notes. It's been working, and my students are, many of them are graduate students, so they're
So
fine.
do
Like
you
they
mean
know what
like
to do.
they actually take notes inside the PowerPoint file? I mean, because
In the
different.
notes, yeah, like in the notes
I
section,
see.
they can
I see.
type their notes. I think it works. It works.
No,
And
but it depends. I mean, different students have different ways of taking notes. You know, some may
yeah.
be taking handwritten notes, other, but you're right. It does make sense for
Mhm.
students to be able to type in the notes section.
Yeah, it helps. I usually post it Nada like 10 minutes before,
Oh,
and it's been working.
That's an
Learning.
interesting question, looking at some of the comments in the chat and even to the question
Yeah.
before. So MBA students, I would say, are very particular. They want their slides, if not a day before, a week before. They want all the content there. They have this idea, working professionals, they need the content. But as a faculty member, you run that challenge of, I'm a firm believer in handwriting notes. I don't like to see them just typing. There's been a lot of research that shows the brain synthesizes information better if it does it through handwritten versus typing. Yes, you can get more information down in your notes through typing, but the brain already makes those connections quicker if you do it through handwriting.
yeah.
I've constantly had that tension as a faculty member of, okay, you want to give them a material to, one of the points of like, especially kind of the flipped learning, you want them looking at content before they come into the lecture so that they're prepared. But also that's on the student to go through and do the readings, that they are coming in ready to have that engagement. And one, I've struggled with a faculty member, so that resonated with me of how do you do this? What's the correct approach? And I think as faculty members, right, I'm constantly tweaking my slides up till the moment, or my content
Right.
up to the moment. And so
Right.
I'm trying to add new examples, or I'm trying to restate it in a better way.
Right.
Right.
I
And
agree.
the other thing I mentioned, right, prohibits faculty sometimes from sharing slides would be that copyright thing, so sort of, if you've put slides and content that's copyrighted, I guess you can put the words copyright on it so that it doesn't get, reused if it's not open content. So maybe this could be a factor sometimes preventing faculty from right out, sharing their slides in their raw format, like in their slide format. But I think it's a great idea.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay,
Sure.
guys, I gotta run. I gotta get into another meeting. Thanks,
Thank you all
everyone.
so much. We will see you all next Thursday for the
Yeah,
webinar. I really appreciate it.
definitely.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks for
Bye, Genia.
attending.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.